caras têm adesivo do Paulo Batista?
Roque. Vai botar uma essa. Entre duas petistas, Fernanda botando essa. Você viu a reportagem da Júlia? Tá. Carreira inicial da Marina, militante de próximo ativista. Olha, o codinome de companheira Sara. Marina. Sou filho dele. Não, mas do ponto de vista libertarianismo, eu sou filho.
É mais nice. Deixa eu socializar uma carne. Os novos Fortaleza são 6 meses. Nômades. Nascido no Espírito Santo e cresceu na faculdade do Rio para São Paulo, que passou 2 anos aqui. 3 anos na USP.
Agora, você tem uma foto,
Um ano de São Paulo, nasceu a primeira filha. Sou eu, minha esposa psiquiatra. Psiquiatra. Aí eu falei, não, não tá dando não. Tipo, ficar só coisa com criança, São Paulo tá pesado. Fortaleza. Lá desde então. Mas eu me achava isolado, sabe? Eu encontro os caras, eu brigando sozinho, né? Não achava ninguém. Eu achei o pessoal cara. Pessoal muito briga, né? Muito briga, bota muito. Dá licença, eu vou trabalhar aqui também. Vamos ver, mas tem área de objetivo? Tem área de objetivo?
Não.
Área de objetivo, né? É muito melhor trabalhar para nós hoje, Na prática, eu fiz qualquer coisa, sabe? Medicina, defesa, para assim, você pega o que dá. Trabalho na área, você sabe melhor que eu. Se você se pegar hoje, dedicação o maior pode cara, mas se desse um eu tenho, eu tenho. Sim, hoje você vê, são biológicos, e aí você fala assim,
no caixão, eu ganho. Não só jogos
Bem, 3h30, vamos retomar o trabalho para que a programação possa correr sem muito atraso. Bom, temos aqui o privilégio de ter uma segunda palestra do professor Peter, professor de Economia e Filosofia da George Mason, Universidade George Mason, autor de vários livros, mais recentes, Living Economics, Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow. O tema da palestra de hoje, segunda palestra do professor Beck, é contra a triagem na economia, desventuras do pronto-socorro econômico. Queria pedir uma salva de palmas para o professor Peter Beck.
Okay, thank you again. It's great here. I have the unenviable task of talking before Ron Paul talks, so I'm sure excited to get to that. And also following the last speaker, who I don't speak Portuguese, but I sat at the back room watching it on TV, and just a natural. So keep speaking. So very good. And it's very important to have people that are articulate and communicate these ideas in such a natural way to keep the sort of spread of these ideas going in the young. This is Against Triage Economics, Misadventures in Economic Emergency Rooms. It's a book that I'm working on at the moment. I've decided to take all the statistics out as I go through here because I was used this. So those who are my professional colleagues, I apologize in front about this. And it's U.S. centric as opposed to world. So it's really focused on the policy responses in the United States after 2008. And the title is Against Triage Economics. That it's really against emergency room economics. That triage is a medical term that's done when you're in like the military or in an emergency situation. Imagine an earthquake hits, and then all of a sudden you go into the hospital and you do triage medicine. And I'm sort of arguing that that's like the worst place to find good medicine, all right? And especially when it comes to economics. And I like pursue this metaphor a little bit. Larry Summers, who's a very, very bright man, but also very confident in himself, he recently defended, economists in the financial crisis by saying, look, economists are doctors to the world. When the world is sick, we're going to go where the illness is. And macroeconomics is our medicine, and we're going to cure the world, okay? And so macro policy is the medicine, monetary policy, fiscal policy are going to be the cures to the ills of unemployment and economic instability. Now, so Summers is using a metaphor. This metaphor of doctors to the world was actually used by the first American Keynesian economist, Laurie Torches, who wrote the first textbook. And he actually said the reason why he converted himself to Keynesianism was because it allowed him to be a doctor to the world. All right, and so now for those of you who have been a little bit knowledgeable about Hayek's position, Hayek is, in contrary to that, argued that the economist should be a humble, actor and should not claim to be a constructivist. In Hayek's own Nobel Prize address, which is called The Pretense to Knowledge, he indicts the economics profession for, in fact, having this position. Let me just read Hayek's own Modern Technology. So I pulled it up, and now I have the quote, which I don't have in my talk. It's always bad when you add quotes at the last minute. If man is not to do more harm than good in his efforts to improve the social order, he will have to learn that in this, as in all other fields where essential complexity of organization prevails, he cannot acquire the full knowledge which would make mastery of the events possible. He will therefore have to use what knowledge he can achieve not to shape the results as the craftsman shapes his handiwork, but rather to cultivate a growth by providing the appropriate environment in the manner in which a gardener does this for his plants. Okay, this is Hayek's position. So the economist is not to be a social engineer, but to be a good gardener. This metaphor you should keep in your heads because it's going to come back again and again through this talk. Anyway, if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up what the term triage means, it's about the assignment of the degrees of urgency in dealing with patients and how you line them up. You can black toe a patient, which means there's no hope for him in your head, or what we can do is figure it out. And this is what the kind of emergency room economists do. Should we engage in monetary policy? Should we engage in fiscal policy in order to save the patient, which is the ailing economy? And this whole talk is against that sort of approach. So here's George W. Bush. Okay. Should point out, by the way, George Bush is not really a free market president. The very first act that he engaged in when he was elected was to provide subsidies to the steel industry. And the last act he did was to nationalize our banking industry, basically. So he kind of stinks as a president for a variety of reasons. But a lot of people on the left view him as kind of a right-wing economist or, kind of a free market guy. And this quote is from December, and he says, well, I have obviously made the decision to make sure that the economy doesn't collapse. I've abandoned the free market principles to save the free market system. Okay? You can read that quote, by the way, from every president, from Roosevelt forward, in some form or other. He's just the latest manifestation of this quote. I have to abandon the free market in order to save the free market. I have to abandon capitalism to save capitalism, that kind of idea. All right? I should point out, by the way, businessmen are not immune to these kind of things either, right? I want to have fair and free competition for everyone except for my industry, right, where I want protection. Joseph Schumpeter, the great historian of thought, used to make a joke. He'd say every time he would talk to an American capitalist, he had to run back home and read The Wealth of Nations to reaffirm his faith in capitalism. And here's the answer to this. Henry Hazlitt. All right? And for the young people out there, as you're just starting off in economics, there still remains no better book to be your first book to study economics than Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So Bastiat and Hazlitt, that's where you should start if you know, and even if you think of yourself as advanced, it's good to go back and read those books again. But Hazlitt, this is in Economics in One Lesson. He says, look, emotional economics has given birth to theories that calm examination cannot justify. So the worst place that we can find our economic theories being evolved and generated is in the cauldron of a crisis, because that's all about emotional economics, not cool-headed economics. And what we want is we want to have cool-headed economics. We want to keep our head in the midst of a crisis, not lose our heads in the midst of a crisis. So the alternative title for my book, I always have battles with people on my titles of my books, because I give the boring academic title. You know, a treatise on blah, 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 blah. And, you know, not my best friend, but my really, really good friend from college, Matt Kibbe, he has a bestseller out right now. It's called Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. So my wife and we know Matt and Terry all the way back when we were in college. And Matt was a good friend of mine in college. And Rosemary, my wife, saw the book and she like smacked me and said, "Why don't you make a title like that?" You know, everyone can understand that. They have no idea what the hell you're saying. So she doesn't like the triage title. So the alternative is Don't Panic. I don't like that because now I'm like my academic colleagues. So I have to come up with some name that no one else understands and sell only 3 copies of the book. My wife, by the way, was the one who came up with Living Economics. My title was the subtitle, Economics for Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And my wife's comment was, she goes, why the hell do you pick these titles? All right, Economics in One Lesson. Emotional economics has given birth to theories that calm examination cannot justify. The economics of illusion, that is Keynesian economics. That's a term that comes from a good colleague of Mises and Hayek and Hazlitt named Albert Kahn, who was a proto-Keynesian economist who then got converted to the monetary theory of the trade cycle and then wrote about what the consequences of Keynesianism is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that today. But what he points here is that it's economics of illusion. So take the talk, so I can't follow Portuguese, but I can follow enough about what you're talking about. In some sense, what you have when you have the picture from The Economist of the Brazilian economy taking off, and then the Brazilian economy failing or whatever, what generates all of that is actually loose monetary policy, right? Policies that direct the allocations into these ideas. During that boom phase, it's not really a boom. It's not really long-term economic growth that's being generated. It's actually a short-term inflating of a bubble. That's illusion. Okay? And to a large extent, the economies in Europe and the United States have been in the era of economic illusion since World War II. So what people call the Great Moderation actually really isn't the Great Moderation. It's an artificial economy. We didn't get into the problems that we're in today under the Bush administration or under Obama. You have to go back much further to see where all of this started to go awry. So here's my main points. Simple economics is not simple-minded. Your economics professors will tell you all the time, you know, oh, that's simple-minded economics. It's not really simple-minded. It's actually simple, basic economics. This ain't rocket science. The demand curve slopes downward. We live in a world of scarcity. We face trade-offs. The persistent and consistent application of the economic way of thinking is hard work. But the basic insights of economics are applied common sense. And you have to continually go back to those first principles. Even in the most extraordinary of times, what is most needed is ordinary economics. In fact, you could make an argument that in the crisis moment, what we need more than anything else is basic economics, not some new exotic economics. We must never buy into the message that it's okay to sacrifice our long-term economic growth for short-term economic relief. Okay? This is what gets us into the whole trouble with the bias toward against deflation. which is that if we believe deflation generates the debt deflation crisis, every tick down in deflation, or if the price is going down, is going to be interpreted as deflation, and therefore we're going to bias the system against any tick down in prices, and then we get permanent inflation. But the reality is that some deflations are actually really good. I don't know how many can see this, but this is my cell phone. This cell phone, it's an Apple, okay, has more computing power than the first computer that I own. Okay? The price of a cell phone back in 1980 was only for the wealthiest people in the world. Okay? So if you go back and watch Dallas reruns, you'll see Victoria Principal, right, with her cell phone. She's the only one who had a cell phone, and you know it's the size of her head and her body, and she's going around. That's why she gets in a car accident, which is the beginning of the concern about cell phones and cars, right? There's the Dallas show. And it costs like $1 gazillion. Now students have these, and they have better ones than me, right? This is the old version of the cell phone. That price of that cell phone, the real price of that has fallen. Is that deflation, or is it just improvements in technology? That's improvements in technology. So that's a difference between, you know, so but yet, if I'm biased the system, I start seeing these prices tick down, I say, oh my God, the economy's going into a tailspin, I need to reinflate the bubble. That, by the way, is the Greenspan era in the United States, what now we call the Greenspan put. Every time Greenspan saw a tick down, what he did was refuel the economy with more expansion of the money supply. This is one of the reasons why Ron Paul is not going to be talking about that tonight, I don't think, but his point about the Fed and why he was so important when he was on that committee is precisely because he's challenging that kind of approach to monetary policy. The idea that you continually refuel the economy by, as my professor used to say, priming the pump, right? Semmelweis was my teacher. So you must not find that. Finally, we need to have politics by principle and not due to either panic nor interest groups. So what I want to point out is that there's nothing new in what I'm saying or what Mises says or what Hayek says that you don't find in Adam Smith when it comes to these kind of public policy questions. Adam Smith pointed out long ago that governments want to do the following thing. They want to run deficits. That accumulates into a public debt. Then they want to monetize the public debt to pay it back with cheaper currency. So they want to monetize inflation. So you engage in deficits, debt, and debasement. And that this is the practice. And as you can read here from this, okay, I'm not going to read this out to you because I already read the Hayek quote and I want to do that again. But if you read here carefully, what he does, he goes through this about the single instance. He says, look, I don't know a single instance where they actually paid it back. They're always going to do this. And as you say, it's almost all states, as well as modern, or ancient as well as modern, have played this very juggling trick. He refers to it as a juggling trick. So in Adam Smith's wisdom, what he's trying to get us to do is recognize that governments want to juggle. So what do you do with jugglers that you don't want juggling? You either tie their hands so they can't juggle, or you take the balls or clubs out of their hands so they can't juggle. So when Hayek writes denationalization of money, which I think is available in Portuguese, is that correct? It is, right? You should go and read that. When Hayek writes denationalization of money, what he's trying to do is cut the juggling by taking money out of the hands of the state, right? So that's one of his reasons for that radical conclusion, which, by the way, he comes to out of frustration, because he tries throughout his whole career to tie the hands of the government, but he's unable to do it. So then eventually he says, we got to pull it. Milton Friedman, by the way, had the same frustration, right? Now, many of you know that Milton Friedman went through in his monetarist phase, you know, the K% rule, right? The government was supposed to target the money supply to the output in the economy. And then he said, oh, we can't rely on humans to do it, so let's put it on a computer. You know, at the end of his life, he actually argued for taking it out of the hands of the state as well. All right, and he became somewhat sympathetic to arguments for free banking. Friedman in Capitalism and Freedom, in a passage which is very often forgotten by his close compatriots, he says, any institution where a sincere error by a few could threaten the existence of the economy is perhaps an institution we can't afford. It's around page 58 of Capitalism and Freedom. Any institution that a sincere error by a few can threaten the existence of the economy is an institution that we can't afford. What was that institution? Central banking, even in Friedman's story, right? So Adam Smith recognizes it, Hayek, Mises, it's the juggling trick. You're supposed to say blue his. The legacy of Lord Keynes. So all of these economists, from Adam Smith all the way up to F.A. Hayek, are making an argument that we should concern ourselves with stopping the juggling. Keynes comes along and convinces the economics profession that our goal is to be master jugglers. That's the job. And the problem is that he, by teaching this technique called macroeconomics, now I'm going to threaten my legitimacy with my colleagues, because there is no such thing as a science of macroeconomics. It's a bunch of made-up stuff. There's only microeconomics, that's economics, okay? There may be macroeconomic phenomena, unemployment, inflation, business fluctuations, but there's only microeconomic explanations and solutions. By the way, for all you students, write that down and bring it up in class. And see your professor's head blow up. Unless they were trained at Chicago or someplace decent. But if they're at Harvard, MIT, they're going to be like, so, microeconomics is economics. It's all about relative prices, prices guide production. Think about Hayek's title of his book, Prices and Production, because prices guide production. All right, I'm not saying I'm Hayek, but that's the reason why my title of my book is Calculation and Coordination. Again, one of those titles that my wife hates. But it's because of calculation, ability to engage in economic calculation, that we're able to achieve advanced economic coordination. That's the point. But so the legacy, so on the flanking of Keynes, I have Hayek's Tiger by the Tail, which is about the inflation. The subtitles of these books are the inflationary legacy of Keynes. Right, the Keynesian legacy of inflation. And then this is Democracy and Deficit by Jim Buchanan. So we have two Nobel Prize winners, 74 and 86. And what Buchanan's arguing here is democracy and deficit, which is the deficits that are the legacy of Keynes, permanent deficits. So despite Keynes teaching us about juggling, our post-Keynes ascendancy world is one that's characterized by inflations and debt problems. So that's what Keynes brought us, a legacy of deficits, debt, and debasement, not prudent macroeconomic management. So these master jugglers are, in fact, social engineers. That's what macroeconomic management of the economy, or aggregate demand management of the economy is. All right, and you're trained to do that. How many here, the students here, have had principles of macroeconomics? I'm not raising your hand. So in very first place of principles of macroeconomics, you learn a Keynesian cross, okay, in which you have a 45-degree line, an aggregate demand curve. Then you have an unemployment equilibrium, and you have a full employment equilibrium. You're stuck in the unemployment equilibrium, and you work the world through the multiplier to be able to get us to the full employment level output. That's the simplest model, supposedly rejected by macroeconomists all the way back to Hicks and the ISLM framework, income expenditure. In the middle of the financial crisis, Paul Krugman wrote an article in the New York Times, and he said, this is the macro policy of the world that we live in. And what he did was he drew the Keynesian cross, the simplest model. And if you think about it, again, think about what TARP was supposed to do. TARP is exactly the Keynesian idea. Do not worry about what you're doing with the government investment. It doesn't matter if you're building potholes. Make the potholes, fill it in. That's going to get the pump priming. And we're going to use the fiscal policy to do that. This is the master jugglers. Bernanke's a master juggler, Yellen's a master juggler, Paulson, all of these guys are trained in these techniques. To the Austrian economists or the classical liberal political economists, the point is that this gives too much discretionary control to the government officials. Friedman argued against this in terms of the long and variable lag, right? That was his criticism. All right, Buchanan argued for a variety of reasons about what the bias in the system was that led to deficits. Hayek argued what the bias in the system is going to lead to inflation. In all of these sort of approaches, a broad brush classical liberal approach to this, it warns against discretionary control being handed to a few men. So what's some unpleasant logic of these master jugglers? Remember Adam Smith's point, remember his point empirically, that no one ever honestly pays out their debts. What Friedman says is that, what Smith says is that in our position of, kicked over some water. If I get electrocuted here, give a scholarship in my name or something. All right, so sorry about that. So what Smith says, I'm capturing my thought here, not kill myself. What Smith says is that what's least harmful to creditors and what's least dishonorable to the debtors would be to have an avowed bankruptcy. In modern terms, you could say that's a repudiation by the government of its debts. It would come along and just say, look, I'm repudiating the debts. Now, why do we always argue that governments can't do the repudiation? Was because they would threaten their legitimacy with their creditors. Right? And you say, oh, so we can't have them repudiate because then that would do. That's in fact Smith's point. Admit you can't make your payments, so stop doing the illusion and admit that you can't do it, and then have yourself constrained. Right? So where does this go awry? Okay. First thing, functional finance. Functional finance was a term developed by an economist named Alan Lerner. And it was to use the idea of the basic idea was don't worry about balancing the budget, worry about using the budget to balance the economy. Okay? So before functional finance, economists were concerned anytime that you ran deficits, that what you should do is pay those deficits back as soon as the crisis was over. So if you ran a deficit because you're fighting a war, or if you ran a deficit because of economic emergency, your goal as soon as that emergency is over is to pay the debt back as fast as possible. Okay? So that was the functional finance idea. But what Buchanan came along and said is, okay, we're going to introduce functional finance within democracies. What actually are the working assumptions in a democracy? Right? So governments want to do, politicians want to do what? They're by definition vote-seeking entrepreneurs. All right? And they have to get votes and campaign contributions from the citizens. So citizens are the demanders of politician services. Politicians are the suppliers. And what you're going to do when you're trying to get elected is you want to maximize your votes and your campaign contributions. So what are you going to do? You're going to promise spending behavior to your constituencies that will vote for you. And so you end up by having a bias in the political system to concentrate benefits on the well-organized, well-informed, and disperse the costs on the unorganized and ill-informed massive voters. The other thing you're going to do is you're going to do that in a short-sightedness fashion. You're going to concentrate benefits today at the expense of tomorrow. Why? What's the least organized and least informed interest group? People that aren't born yet. So if I build a big project today and then make the people 25 years from now pay for it, they have no say in why it is that that's not going to happen, right? And so Buchanan says, look, functional finance is okay over the life of the business cycle. That makes sense. But the problem is that in democracies, there's no incentive for politicians to run there's surpluses in the times of plenty. There's lots of incentives for them to run deficits in the times of crisis, but no effort or acknowledgement for them to run surpluses in times of plenty. So as a result, what you're going to get is permanent deficits, which then accumulate in public debt. I already mentioned before about this deflation and the cost of inflation. Here's the bottom line. It's very simple again. Goods buy money and money buys goods. In a modern economy, goods don't buy goods. So money is 1/2 of all exchanges in the economy. So get ready for the complicated economic insight. If you screw around with money, you screw around with all the exchanges in the economy. Don't get nervous, that's a very simple point, but it's actually what it means to have non-neutral money. Meaning that money is a link to all exchanges in the economy. So if I distort the money unit, I distort all the exchanges in the economy. So by us biasing the system against deflation, we commit ourselves to permanent inflation. Those permanent inflations are not just adjustments of the prices, right? It's not just the adjustment of what we call menu costs or shoe leather costs, all right? It's actually that adjustment takes time, and as a result, the exchanges that are affected by the non-neutral money are going to lead to malinvestments. And that's going to generate discoordination in your economy, which means you're going to have real losses. Business cycles are going to be generated by that. With those business cycles are tied to people various different employment and investment decisions, in particular the allocation of talent. So talented people get attracted to various different activities, which in a market they wouldn't be attracted to if there was a market, but since the government is now expending resources, they get drawn to that. That's part of the Friedman argument against crowding out, or Friedman argument about crowding out, right? There's one way to think about crowding out, which is that public investment crowds out private investment, because private investment is interest sensitive, government investment is not. But it's also the case that if government becomes the main investor, talented people that otherwise would be in the private sector allocate their resources over to the public sector. And so you have a misallocation not only of capital, but of talent, that when the bad investment reveals itself, has to be reallocated and reshuffled. Or another way to think about it is recalculated, right? You have to recalculate labor, you have to recalculate capital, and you have to recalculate these investment decisions. And manipulating money and credit distorts that recalculation process. It's one of the reasons why, when the investments turn out to be wrong investments and we adjust, why it's so costly in the adjustment period. Right? There's no symmetry, by the way, between the boom and the bust. So a boom can be a slight, and then the bust has to be severe, or the boom can be big and the bust it depends on other factors, what's going on with technology at the time and whatnot. But there's no claim to symmetry in the Austrian cycle theory. All there is there's distortions that need to be recalculated. And those recalculations are costly. And so we have to keep that in mind when we think about what kind of policy. Here's the United States government. Okay? Promissory politics means this issue of putting a chicken in every pot. Right? This has been our notion, right? Obama ran in 2008 on the following thing: hope and change, not more of the same. What the hell does that mean? No one really knows. Hope and change, but that was a big promise to everyone, right? So it means 1,000 different promises to everyone. It's just a more vague way of saying I'm going to get a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, right? Kind of thing when you're running. Populist politics gone amok, and that's America. But what does that populist politics generates to? It generates the promises that we oblige government to engage in. So we're going to say, oh, okay, look, we're going to pay for your retirement. So what's wrong with the United States at the moment? Good things, by the way. We're retiring younger, we're living longer, and we expect to live during that retirement just as well off as we did when we worked. That's a pretty good deal, right? So it used to be the case that, basically you retired at 68 and you died at 70. At that point, you're not really eating up much of the Social Security benefits, right? It's like you're a good deal for the younger generation. But now what's happened is it's a Christmas tree. Okay, it used to be the case the Christmas tree looked like this, and now it's looked like this. Meaning that the population growth underneath is much lower than the population that needs to be sustained. And the advances have in fact improved, so the baby boomers are going to live to be 90, and there's not that many kids coming up, so that means the share that they have to pay to do this is, again, it's not rocket science, okay? This is really applied common sense and demographics. So the United States government plays tricks, by the way, with the numbers. I was just looking at some numbers before I came in here. I promise you I wouldn't do big statistics, but I want you to do something. For those of you who are really interested in this, look at what the CPI would say if it was calculated the way it was in 1980, and then look at the way this, what the CPI would say today if it was calculated as it was in 1990. So what we try to do, all right, it was over 10% if it's 1980, around 8% if it's 1990 calculations. We recalculated under Boston, right? We recalculated the way that we do CPI so that we suppress inflation in your calculation. So we can run around and say we're not going to have a misery index anymore. Right? That's what Ronald Reagan ran on in 1979, right? It was double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, the misery index. That's what Jimmy Carter gave us. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And then Reagan said in 1984, that's what he ran on. He just said, are you better off? People said, yes, Ronnie. And they voted for him. Whereas under Jimmy Carter, they said, no, Jimmy. And so Jimmy Carter ended up by not being a president. And became a statesman, and fixing houses and stuff. So, if you ask the government what our debt is, they tell you it's around $12 trillion. But if you actually calculate the promises that we've made, all right, and the obligations the government has committed itself to the citizens, our debt is actually $205 to $211 trillion. Which means that the United States isn't broke 40 years ago, it's broke today. Okay? It's a broke country right today, just like Greece or something. All right? The problem is that we're the biggest bear on the block, right? So as a result, you know, I'll come back to this in the end, but you know, if you're having a fight and a bear's trying to catch you, and you're running with your friend who happens to be like rotund, and you're like a quick, swift one, you don't really have to worry about it, right? Because the bear's going to eat the fat one. All right, that's other economies. The United States like the swifter one, right? And the United States actually right now, which postulated has a broken leg, but they're really good with the, you know, the crutch and the fat guy can't run at all, so he just like gets eaten, and you're like, good. But so this is an interesting sort of picture. The person to read on this is Lawrence Kontokoff, who was a professor at Boston University. And he's done the most work on what's called intergenerational accounting, trying to count the beans of how much money is owed to Americans, what's the ability of Americans to pay for that amount of money. And the shocking thing that Kontokoff tells us is that in order for the U.S. to currently meet its obligations with no increase in those obligations, by the way, just imagine what that's like, no increasing in the promises that politicians are making. So from now on, they're not going to make any promises. That's not going to happen, right? But when he says, in order to do that, and with our current population, we would have to cut government expenditures by 40%, and we would have to increase marginal tax rates by 60%. Understand what that means. That means we'd be paying marginal tax rates in the United States in the 90% range, and we would be slashing 40%, and only in that could we imagine the fiscal gap closing. That's political nightmare for the United States, right? So as a result, what they're going to try to do is exactly what they are doing, which is paper over the gap, right? Which is what's going on. So I have a paper that was published by the LSE called The Debt Inflation Theory of the Financial Crisis, which is a slightly different take on the debt deflation theory of the crisis, which is associated with Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman. But it's a debt inflation, and it relates to the earlier period where the fiscal imbalance leads to the monetization, which then causes the disturbances, which then eventually lead to the debt problem and then the liquidity problem. Okay? So Bernanke, Yellen, and the Fed endgame. So here's one of the things. The United States, if you follow, we have in the last 2 decades engaged in a lot of activity where we don't know what the end game is. So we just jump in, but we have no idea how to exit. I don't want to talk about foreign policy at the moment, but that's exactly what's gone on in our Fed. The Fed decided that the house was on fire. They took the hose, they sprayed it as much as they could to try to put the fire out. And now what's happening is they don't know how to turn the fire off. They're tampering or sort of tapering the hose, but they don't really have it. Now, let me step back for a second just to explain Bernanke. For those of you who are young here, Bernanke's not like the devil incarnate or something like that. He's actually a really good economist who studied the Great Depression and probably studied the Great Depression besides Milton Friedman more than any other economist. He has a famous paper from 1983 where he thinks he has identified why the Great Depression happened and why its severity was so great. And the easiest way to say that is he believes that its credit transmission mechanism was broken. And the easiest way to understand that in a metaphor is imagine that you're in the upstairs of your house and you go to take a shower and you turn the water on and no water comes out. That's a liquidity crisis. There's no water coming out. You say, like, what the hell happened in my house? So you go in your basement and you notice that the pipe has been busted. And all the water that you're calling up to come out of your shower is going all over your basement floor. Now what do? All right? The first thing you have to do is you got to fix the pipe. That was the nationalization of the banks. Right? Because if the credit transmission mechanism is broken, the water is always going to just end up on no matter how much monetary policy you engage in. So fix the pipe and then pump it with what? Water. To get the water pressure up so that it can go back to your shower. That's how to understand what Bernanke was trying to do. And he was a sincere actor in that. The problem is his theory is wrong from our perspective. But it's not that he was, sort of a guy sitting there saying, how can I bankrupt the country and become really rich myself? Which is a lot of politicians. They get busted, like Catherine Legrand right now. Right? Well, you know that she was a finance minister under France. Now she's the head of the IMF. She's under charges right now of corruption because, her and Sarkozy were paying off their credit, right? And so and she yelled at everyone for supposedly being, greedy. I love it. Anyway. So my favorite observer of politics is not an academic, that's a guy, and he would have understood this perfectly, but I can't quote him. I'll do it as a whole. Anyway, Bernanke and Yellen in the end, and the Fed ending. So these people are trying to, fuel the economy with cash to defeat the liquidity crisis. He came up with, the quantitative easing and then also Operation Twist. And in doing that, now Yellen has taken over, and she's also committed. She's tapering. She's cutting back, right? But she is committed to the idea that anytime the unemployment rate clicks up, she'll fuel the money again with cash. Okay? So here's the problem. Even master, right? So rather than taking on the whole Keynesian apparatus right now, which I am willing to do, and I gave you some suggestions about that with regard to microeconomics. But let's assume that all this juggling is the right way to go. The real problem we have to ask ourselves is when the task is very difficult, even master jugglers might drop the ball. And that's what we've asked Bernanke and now Yellen to be. Master jugglers balancing on a ball, juggling, and they might drop it. And when they drop it, what are the consequences? This is what's wrong with triage economics. We've empowered people in an emergency to take extraordinary measures, violating the basic principles of economics and common sense. And if they fail in their task, the consequence is not that the patient just has lost an arm, it's that the patient stops beating. We need to get back to some common sense wisdom about the way the economy is operated. Bounded by the rule of law, respect for private property, freedom of prices, accurate profit and loss accounting. All right, so is this the end? No, not the end. I'm going to end on a high note here. Because Adam Smith tells us there's lots of ruin in the nation. And then again, I don't want to read a whole quote from you here, but I want to sort of stress the following. Okay? The natural effort of every individual to better his own condition, I never going to read the quote. Better his own condition when suffered to exert itself with freedom and security is so powerful a principle that it is alone and without any assistance not only capable of carrying on the society with wealth and prosperity, but of surmounting 100 impertinent obstructions with which the folly of human laws too often encumbers its operation. Okay? The folly of human laws too often encumbers its operation. We can overcome that. The counterfactual, all right, is that we are overcoming all of this weighted down view because we have great innovation. So let me just end with a mission, with a vision here for you. The first thing is I'm going to call these horses Smith for the gains from trade, Schumpeter for the gains from innovation, stupidity for government. Okay? As long as the gains from trade and the gains from innovation continue to outpace the losses that we suffer due to government stupidity, the economy tomorrow will be better than today. The counterfactual is how much better could have we been had we not had the distortions caused by stupidity. And that's the question that we have to sort of come to grips with. Because what we want to do is we want to promote long-term economic growth. And all of our efforts to provide short-term relief undermine our long-term economic growth. And we don't eat growth rates, by the way. So I'm not just, it's not like an obsession with growth. It's what growth purchases for us, which is longer life expectancy, right? Better, more convenient living, all these kinds, better education, greater access to educational opportunities and whatnot for minorities and for women. All right? Growth buys us all kinds of things that we find desirable for living a flourishing human life. If you kill the goose that lays the golden egg, you cut back the ability of people to live flourishing lives. And what liberty should be about is human flourishing, not equality or anything. It's about flourishing. And that's our. In order to do that, we have to always make sort of drag our economy going all the way back from Adam Smith all the way up to today. So thank you very much.
Vorrei esattamente in época foi de 87, 81.
I want to bring this chair back home so I can sit and teach my classes. Hello, students. Okay, yep.
Yeah. Muito bem, então vamos iniciar a sessão de perguntas.
Okay, thanks.
Vamos iniciar então a sessão de perguntas. O professor acha que a resposta que o governo, a decisão do governo para poder resolver a crise, mediante o uso de liquidez excessiva, ainda pode trazer um outro choque a curto ou médio prazo?
Yeah, this is so just to put things in the American context, I would say that the most dangerous book published this summer was not Thomas Piketty's book on inequality. It's not a big surprise for a French intellectual to complain about that. But the more damaging book for people from our side that we have to address is a book by a man named Dan Dresner, who is, broadly speaking, a classical liberal, and he wrote a book called basically that the system works. And his argument is that we did all the right policy steps to prevent us from going to Armageddon, and that we have to go, that line. And I think we have to address this book because the counterfactual is that we are walking around and the economy isn't a complete basket case, right? But
The reality is, I think, is that we also haven't seen the consequences of the massive liquidity that has been thrown into the economy. Part of the reason is that the banks haven't been lending out the money yet. They've been holding on to the money, so there's a tremendous amount of reserves that once they go in, that goes back to the point about the end game. So what is the end game? How does the Fed soak up all this excess reserves? So I used to say to my students that, this is my undergrad students, I'd say I'd pay them $100 if they could draw a really good cartoon of Ben Bernanke in a helicopter dumping cash out of one thing, right? That's Friedman's helicopter, but then having a vacuum cleaner with his foot sucking up the excess reserves. And if we could do that at the same time. This is the dance that we've asked Bernanke to engage in, or now Yellen to engage in. And it's a that's what I mean by the metaphor of the clown on the juggling ball, right? It's asking them to juggle something which a master juggler would have a very difficult time doing, even if that was the right policy. So my own view is that we have basically been seeing a kind of reinflating of the bubble in the United States. This has been captured in the asset prices that have been driven up in the United States, and that there has been technology. Here's something that will prove me wrong. Not really prove me wrong, but would be a countervailing force. Some form of massive nanotechnology that led to a massive increase in our productive capacities. And the Internet 2.0 kind of claim that people are making, right? That will offset these negative consequences, and you'll end up by being able to grow. And I think that that's so, but my view is, so I can't predict. By the way, I'm not a good investment advisor. I always say people, my wife, you know, I go to cocktail parties with my wife and people say, oh, you're an economist. And then there's two responses. One is they look like they just drank sour milk and they're like, economics like the worst subject they had in college. And I'm like, great. And then the other one is, where are interest rates going? And so now I have a snarky response, which is, if I knew where interest rates were going, I wouldn't be at this party with you. Right? I'd be in Barbados or something, you know, enjoying life. You know? The bottom line is that all I can do is look at the patterns. I can't predict what the offsetting factors are that are going to like change. So you could have these things, but right now I would say we're in a very precarious position because we have in fact fueled the economy and we haven't yet seen the corrections fully take place. That was long-winded. I'll try to be shorter.
Como modificar o sistema econômico baseado em dívida e inflação no arranjo democrático atual?
Yeah. All right, so you guys all understand the question? If I could solve this, I wouldn't be here either. Look, I mean, we have to have a re-examination of what we mean by democracy. So I think Hayek has a very important distinction in the Constitution of Liberty where he makes a distinction between liberalism and democracy, in which what we need to have is a re-examination of liberalism and then democracy. So we shouldn't have the democratic fetish. Just because we can have illiberal democracies. And so we got to guard against that. Just because something's democratic doesn't mean it's good. And we need to understand. So that goes back to the question that we need to ask about the scale and scope of government. It's not the size of government, it's the scope of government, which means what are the appropriate roles of government in a society. And we have to understand that if we're going to starve the state of responsibility, we have to see the private sector in its nonprofit and for-profit avenues actually fill in the gap. So there has to be ways in which the things that people fear about free societies. People fear freedom. They fear the lack of security. They fear lack of a safety net, all that stuff. We have to show that market mechanisms or voluntary mechanisms can fill in the gap effectively to take care of problems, social problems of poverty, ignorance, and squalor. You can't just say, oh, let it all happen, poverty, ignorance, squalor, who cares? You have to show that the voluntary sector, because if the state's not going to do it, then the private sector in its voluntary or for-profit sector has to fill in the gaps through charity or through other mechanisms of civil society. That's the challenge for young people. the young people have to sort of grab onto that idea and make what a free society looks like. Not a free economy only, but a free society. A free society is a radical vision of a change in which we interact with one another. And in that sense, we treat each other in that world democratically, what's really meant by democracy, which is that we treat each other not as means to an end, but as equals, true equals in an exchange. Now, is that what democracy means today? No. Democracy means today, one man, one vote, right? Majority rule, right? And that is all kinds of problems. That's what leads to that picture of the debt that I showed you up there, which is because I make promises to Peter and rob Paul to pay the promises. All right? And that's just that robbing Peter to pay Paul needs to stop if we're going to somehow get our economic systems under control. I keep on forgetting. I've learned Portuguese.
O Krugman disse uma vez que não há problema em criar débito público, deve ser, né? Pois, nas palavras do Krugman, nós estamos devendo para nós mesmos. Qual a sua opinião a respeito disso?
Yeah. I actually didn't need to listen because as soon as you said Paul Krugman, I had a response. Not really. But part of the reason why Krugman can make arguments that he makes is he believes that we live in a world of idle resources, right? And so therefore, there's no cost to the policies mistakes that are going on because we're living in a world of idle resources. That means it's the world of non-scarcity. Right? That means that you're not going to have those things. So in a world of an aggregate demand failure, that's actually what the world looks like. So all he cares about is getting the spending going. All right? And then that's going to go. It's also the case that he's going to argue that inflation or monetary policy is not going to be effective because monetary policy is like pushing on a string. So imagine the metaphor of a table here, and I had a shoelace on the table. And I tried to push the string to the end of the table from the back. What would happen to the string? It would ball up and not go anywhere, right? That's what Krugman believes is going on if you just engage in monetary policy. So what you need to do is you need to pull the string from the other end. And that's fiscal policy. So that's why he believes you need to use fiscal policy, not monetary policy. And that's why in 2013, the discussion over austerity was such a critical point that Krugman's unwilling to now fess up to. But the reason why that was a testing point was because he claimed that the cutbacks in government expenditures in the United States would lead to the United States economy collapsing. And it actually turned out not to be the case. Now, I should step back for a second. The debate is wrong because we actually didn't engage in austerity. What we did was we engaged in creative accounting. Now imagine that I'm the Department of Education and I ask for $100, my budget needs to be $100 better next year. And the government comes back and says, no, we're only going to give you $50 next year. What the people at the government office are going to say is, you slashed my budget by 50%. When in reality, I increased your budget. But they're going to claim I smashed it, and so Krugman's going to say, oh, see, that's austerity working. And whatnot. It's really not the case. But Krugman's unwilling to deal with the own claim that he made, and he's trying to run circles, to try to get out of this. But the reality is that he believes that you can do this because we live in an economy that's characterized by idle resources. Therefore, anything that we do to motivate the movement of those idle resources is going to be positive to the economy. As W.H. Hutt wrote a long time ago, sometimes idle resources are idle for a reason. Those are the only idle resources because they actually shouldn't be being used. But the ones that are actually there, we're in a world of scarcity. And by misallocating them in the wrong way, the crowding out effect, we are going to pay a consequence. Go ahead.
O professor falou durante a palestra que o não era um agente do mal, do demônio. Ele apenas seguia as políticas aceitam só pertencem à escola keynesiana, qual é o problema deles? É falta de informação ou escolha teórica equivocada?
All right, that's a big question because it has a lot to do with what happens to the transformation of economic education post the World War II. So some politicians, some appointments are actually a little bit more political. Arthur Burns' diaries that Nixon, pressured Burns to generate a business cycle, basically by fueling the economy during the election cycle, so that Nixon would win. And he accommodated that. So the Fed has a history of accommodating political pressure. That's different from the theoretical argument that I was making. So the point I was just trying to make is that in Bernanke's sense, what you can see is his practice was consistent with his theories. It was a theory-consistent practice, as opposed to, say, Greenspan, whose theories were ones to fight inflation, but yet he was an inflationary Fed chairman. Okay, right? Why did Greenspan do what he did? It's different. So I think as a general rule, by the way, in debate, we should assume the best of intentions on the part of our opponents, even when that might not be true. But we should assume that and then show that on their own terms, they failed to achieve their goals. That's Mises's method, right? That's Mises's method. Rothbard had criticisms of that. I disagree with Rothbard's criticisms as it strictly comes to economics, which Rothbard actually isn't criticizing when strictly economics, it's criticizing for public policy. But I think Mises's argument is the right way to go. You treat ends as given, you limit your analysis to the efficacy of chosen means to those given ends, and you show that your opponent made a mistake on their own terms. That way you have a greater chance of nudging the conversation in direction more towards the position that you hold. That would be my strategy in all intellectual exchanges. Now, do I always agree with that? No, of course. Sometimes, the people that you're talking about are actually really, they are satisfying their needs, which is, I want to maximize my power. Frank Knight had a great line. He said, people say the following thing: I need power to achieve X, Y, and Z. Knight says, I stopped listening after the first 3 words because those are the only ones I can believe. I need power, right? And so we have to recognize that. But I think that takes us outside the realm of economics and more in political theory and moral theory. I'm coming.
Há alguma contradição ou tipo de imoralidade para quem é um estudioso ou está iniciando no estudo da escola austríaca, que essa pessoa trabalhe para o Estado, para o governo?
Okay. So I work at a state university. Okay. When I decided to go to graduate school at George Mason University, which has a very strong connection of market-oriented people, my undergraduate teacher, Hans Senholz, told me that I was going to a state university. And he just said that. He said, you're going to a state university? And I said, yeah. He says, you will become a Keynesian? And I'm like, there's no Keynesians there, Dr. Senholz. He says, you will be a Keynesian? But in the United States, it's important to recognize that the politics of universities are such that almost all universities except for Grove City College and Hillsdale College accept some form of federal influence, federal funding. And so all private universities have funding in them. A lot of public universities have private funds in them. It's like mixed hybrid forms. So I don't think that I think our goal is to try to be in the best position that we can be in to leverage our ideas to spread, our ideas throughout the society. I think that's also true for people who care about politics. So I don't think there's anything immoral about going into politics if that's your interest and that's what turns you on. Just like I don't think there's anything wrong going to work for the Fed What I think is wrong is if you do things that are in violation of what you believe to be true. I think the goal of the economist is simply to speak truth to power. Period. End of story. Never to modify what your message is to be politically popular. The goal of the economist is simply to rain on the parade of the populace, all right, and so to pop the popular fallacies. And so if you're an economist working in government and you're actually popping fallacies, I think you're doing God's work, in quotes. Okay. On the other hand, if you're a free market radical who goes and works in government, and then the next thing you know, you're advocating rent controls, I think then you've kind of sold out or whatever. It's safe for an academic to say about selling out, but I think that's what happens, and I think you don't want to be captured. You don't want to be captured by the regulatory apparatus. So we need to work to stop government capture of economists. Let me just give you one story. Ronald Coase, who's actually one of my favorite economists, he wrote a famous paper on about the FCC and allocating the spectrum rights. And just recently I came across a letter that Coase wrote in response to a criticism where someone accuses him of being bought out by the radio interest to argue for auctioning off the spectrum like that, right? And Coase writes this brilliant letter. He's an English gentleman, so he never gets nasty with anyone. And he writes this letter where he says, look, I didn't receive a penny from the broadcasting industry, but then he writes a defense of why mercenary scholars would probably outproduce those scholars who believe that they're doing it for the public interest, and that the public interest scholar would actually probably do more damage to society than someone who just says, I'm in it for the money. And he explains the logic of all of this. And it's a brilliant sort of exposition. So I actually think economists, the goal of economists is simply to speak truth to power, to do economics to the best that you can, and to sort of try to challenge the popular fallacies that are so attractive to politicians.
Muito bem, bom, nós estouramos o tempo. Eu queria encerrar agradecendo mais uma vez ao professor Beto pela segunda e excelente palestra. É um privilégio para nós aqui no Brasil termos e poder aprender com a sua inteligência e com a sua comunicação. Muito obrigado.
I needed a better ending statement. I didn't know it was the end. Watch that water.
Melhor preparado. Não é uma questão de conhecimento.
Vou te mandar todos depois.
Não, nem precisa, eu pego direto do seu. Ah, é o vídeo do lado.
Eu passei no WhatsApp, legal. Passa pra você editar, entendeu? Porque tem qualidade. Passa a ficha no 4K. Passa 800 mega.
Eu me passo mesmo.
Não posso abrir, não posso.
Deixa eu ver, tem você? Ué, tem que conferir, óbvio.
Pô, tu fez implante?
Você viu?
Segue de boa. Ficaram na guerra d'água? Tomava banho de bico. Faz uma festa lá, muito fresco, cara. Você chegou, aí tava.
Você quer transmissão?
Tá parado.
Podemos conversar depois, que vai começar agora.
tarde, boa tarde. Todos os senhoristas, por favor, comentem os assentos, podemos falar de falar. Igual a gente tem que falar para dar uma informação. Bom, boa tarde. Chegamos então à última palestra da conferência depois de ontem e hoje, de intensa e excelente programação, chegamos agora à palestra final, convidado de honra desse evento. O Ron Paul, acho que cada um de vocês que está aqui sabe provavelmente mais detalhes sobre a região que eu. De qualquer forma, eu vou fazer uma apresentação formal bastante curta para que a gente possa tocar o evento. Ron Paul é médico e ex-deputado republicano do Texas, foi candidato à presidência dos Estados Unidos em 88 pelo Libertarian Party e candidato à nomeação para as eleições presidenciais de 2008 e 2012 pelo Partido Republicano. É autor de vários livros, alguns dos quais traduzidos para o português, lançados aqui no Brasil, inclusive pelo Instituto Mises Brasil. São eles os livros Mises, Escola, Austríaca, uma visão pessoal, Definindo a Liberdade e O Fim do FED, o que acabar com o Banco Central, que eu traduzi em coautoria com a Mônica Magalhães. O Ron Paul vai proferir essa palestra com o tema, que é o título do seu livro, Definindo a Liberdade. Senhoras e senhores, pediram uma salva de palmas para o nosso convidado, Ron Paul. It's wonderful. I talked a lot about ideas having consequences, and I know you all agree with that. And this is where it starts. Groups like this, and it's spreading. You know, it used to be very difficult to find good groups like this. I was in high school and college in the 50s and got interested in that. Boy, you couldn't find a group like this any place. The United States would have a couple, but now they're spreading. And that is why I was anxious to come, and I didn't realize that the welcome would be so generous, and I thank you very much for that very nice welcome. Some people ask me how I got started in this, having gone to medical school and been involved in medicine for a long time. But along with medicine, I did get fascinated with Austrian economics. I imagine the first book on economics was the Road to Start from Hayek, which many of you have read already and know about, and books are being sold. And I came across that book, and it really fascinated me. So I went from there into the various Austrian economists to read and study, along with studying of medicine. But it was probably the August 15th date of 1971 that really stirred my excitement about the correctness of the Austrian economists. You know, I'd read about it. They had made the predictions that Bretton Woods agreement would not work, and lo and behold, it didn't work. Even Henry Hess, back when they set up the Bretton Woods, predicted that that wouldn't work. So that sort of convinced me that my instincts and what I had been reading and studying were absolutely correct. And after that, I decided I would like to speak out on economic policy. But how would I do this? I was busy in a medical practice, and that happened in '71, and it was in 1973 when I got this idea of maybe speaking out more.
And so 1973 and 1974 was, as many of you probably know, it wasn't a very good year for Republicans. That was the Watergate year, and Nixon, of course, was one that closed the gold window and got into all kinds of trouble. So nobody wanted to run. The Republican Party was very weak in Texas at that time, so nobody wanted to be a candidate. So I put up my hand. I said, okay, yeah, do it. Nobody else was to do it. And so I had to, confer with my wife and find out what she thought about it. And I told her about my plan. This is what I'm going to do. I feel strongly about this. And the day after those announcements on August 15th, that was a Sunday night, what happened was the Chamber of Commerce, the National Chamber of Commerce, came out in strong support of it. What's going on in this world, that they supported this position. So I told her that she wasn't much into this. We had 5 kids, and she was pretty busy taking care of her kids and not worrying about these kind of things. So I told her, I said, I'm going to run for Congress, and told her why I wanted to speak out. And she said, that's going to be very dangerous. That's not going to be dangerous. What's dangerous about running for Congress? She said, you might get elected. But I guaranteed her that couldn't happen. You will, because they want to hear the truth. And she made a prediction. She said she didn't know anything about politics, but she predicted back then that I would eventually win. But it was something that, in politics, you never know what will come of it. So many people that come to the rallies and all in the States, a lot of people come, what do? I want to be a congressman. I said, the first thing is don't set your goal to be a congressman. That is not to be your goal. Your goal is to understand our problems and understand how liberty will solve those problems. And the rest will become available to you. If there's something out there, somebody will come and you're knowledgeable and respect you for your knowledge. You'll have something to do. You might need to start your own organization. Just like somebody came along and started this organization. You don't know. Some people will run for Congress. Some people will be in the media. Some people will become teachers and writers and all kinds of things. But the most important thing is the issues and the ideas. But that's where the good news is that things are so different compared to the 1970s and 1960s. Because there's so much going on. There's a couple things going on. There's a lot of seeds have been planted. I helped Lou Rockwell in the early 1980s to get the Mises Institute started and the ideas that are being spread. But there's a vehicle now available to us, and that, of course, is the Internet. And I think this is fantastic. The libertarians, when the Internet first became available to us, there were some libertarians who predicted, well, this is great. You read your book and get your book right off the Internet. And you don't have to go out and buy books and things like that. That might be helpful, but I still like books. So lo and behold, that didn't happen. Yes, the Internet spread the messages, but it also announced where you can get information, where you can come to the rallies, and where you can buy a book. It used to be that I would have a staff person say, well, I heard about this book. You go to the bookstore, get this book, and you'll never be there. They'd order the book in a couple of weeks and I get the book. Today, what do? I click on Amazon, and in about 2 days, the book's on my doorstep. And more books are being sold, not less. And I understand, but the ideas are out there. That not only is the vehicle available to us, but also the evidence is in. The system that we have been put up with for so long, economics and foreign policy, foreign intervention, needless wars, violation of our rights by our governments, it's also clear that it's way over the top. And that, for instance, Keynesian economics is based on deeply flawed ideas, and it's failing, and most people know it, and we're going to get rid of Keynesian economics throughout the world. Let's think 100 years about nothing. We've been messing around with that intervention. And of course, 100 years ago, our government, the United States, started this central banking. It has grown and grown by leaps and bounds to control all the economy. The central economic planner, not by a few group, a small group, but one person. Can you imagine the preposterous notion that one individual would be seen as capable of understanding exactly what the interest rate should be on what day next year? It is absolutely bizarre, and it's failing, and it's going to fail, and that is what we're witnessing these last 7 years. Has shown that the more you print, the worse the economy gets. They don't understand, at least the ones in charge, why debt is bad and why accommodating the politicians who spend money is bad. And Keynes, of course, taught that. Deficits don't money, spending is necessary. You don't have it, borrow. Nobody will loan it to get printed. Well, it hasn't been working so well lately, and because of the failure, the blatant failure of this fiat monetary system that we've been living with for so long, is failure, and that means the doors are wide open, and that is why you're so important, because you have a grasp of what is necessary, the difference, and why this system that we have will not continue, and it has to be replaced. So the ideas of whether it's money or free markets, property rights, or whatever, it is so important. I want to talk a little bit about statistics, because people do, that's one thing that commentators are always referring to. One statistic is the 99 and the 1. The 1% have all the wealth, the 99 against the 1%, and that goes back and forth. And of course, Occupy Wall Street was something that popped up with the American campaign in our presidential races, and they pestered a lot of the other candidates a lot more than they pestered me, because my approach was a little bit different. Because I recognized that there was a lot of wealth in our country that was undeserved, that they achieved it because they manipulated the monetary system. They were able to practice, pyramiding of debt, getting contracts from the government, part of the military-industrial complex, and then after making all that money, including in the housing market, the whole thing goes bust. Guess what? Who got bailed out? Participants in the 1%. But the one thing that I did differently was I pointed out that it wasn't the fact that there were some people who had wealth that you had to come down on, because right now there's a big move on, tax the wealthy, and redistribute the wealth, and this will solve the problem. The big thing is, and the Occupy people came, and they sat and listened to us, but you should make a difference between how people have their wealth. If they earn it because they provide a great product or a great service for us, nobody should be so envious that we have to take it away from them. But if they got it there by ill means, by being participants and partners with the government and the Federal Reserve, those are the people who don't deserve it, and they don't deserve the bailouts, and they deserve to go bankrupt, not the average guy on the street. Still have to contend with that, because it's a very strong emotion. One of the things that I had mentioned when he talks about the works rise to the top, because they play on this. The people are in this, and will play on this, and you see it constantly like this. And of course, the other thing he said was that people rise to the top under that sort of circumstances is because they have no moral scruples. And I keep looking around when I'm watching them. Yeah, I can go along with that. No moral scruples to the people, follow the trap of being envious of others. But there is another statistic, and that is governments have to be endorsed by the people. They have to go along. They might not fully understand it, but they say even in place that it has communism, the majority of thinkers to go on with the system. Eventually, it looks like the majority figures it's not working too well. You know, even the Soviet system collapsed. That to me was the most remarkable political economic event of the 20th century. The whole thing disappears, and one of my arguments I use that we don't need to be worrying about a country that doesn't have a nuclear weapon and try to fight a war with them over a non-existent weapon when we stood and existed in the Cold War against the Soviet. And during that period of time, of course, I was in the Air Force during the 60s. But it collapsed because one reason people no longer supported it wasn't working. They didn't have money. They did something so foolish. They went into Afghanistan and stayed too long. So we learn a lesson now and then about going to Afghanistan. So that 51% is very important. Mises actually talks about this, not in these precise terms, but most people in the free market and the freedom movement realize that you have people who like theories and who like and explain the philosophy and how it works. And Mises was obviously one of those. And he says that's very, very important. And he said that there has to be either those individuals who write the theories or others, like maybe us, to take these issues and these ideas and make them palatable to the majority of the people. And I've often thought about that, always trying to think if I can understand those issues and understand how to answer these questions to try to neutralize this effort to play on envy and all the distortions, and those answers can be given, then maybe we can convert the people. And that means the 51%. But Leonard Reed frequently would say, and Leonard Reed was one of my opinion, I was opinion of his, and one place where I did get a lot of literature was the Foundation for Economic Education up on the Irvington on the river in New York. But he would keep repeating this in a similar way. He says, it's not a numbers game. You don't sit here and say, okay, we have a large group here, and now your job is to go out and convert 51% of the people in Sao Paulo. Oh, how am I going to do that? How are we going to make libertarians out of all that? No, if you do that, it becomes overwhelming. But if you have 7 or 8% of a society that agrees on the right ideas and then become influential, the 51% can see, it's palatable. It's in my best interest to go along with liberty. And liberty has to be built up as a wonderful, wonderful thing, not only for personal liberty, it has to be built up for peace. And understanding liberty means that there will be no aggression, no preemptive war, and that there would be a much greater chance of prosperity. And that is a job of the few. So the wonderful thing about coming to an event like this and talking with a group like this is that you're part of that 8%. And if you're not fully there, you will become there. Because a lot of times individuals who come to my rallies and they would get enthusiastic and say, I agree with all this. And I say, well, guess what? You're not going to be comfortable for the rest of your life. Because you're going to feel compelled that you have to do something about it. And that's why you come to events like this. The average person doesn't come to an event like this off the street. They come here because either they know what the answers are, or you're curious about it, and you want to know more about it, or maybe you're trying to figure out, what can I do? And, of course, through the campaign, that would be fun. What should I do? I agree with you. Tell me what I have to do. And my answer was sort of flippant. I said, do whatever you want. Create a new organization. Dr. He'll tell you how to do it. There's always something else, and there's something unique about the creativity. And now it doesn't take a TV station. The TV stations are our competitors. Now things are so much different that we can reach a lot of people through the internet and various other tools and fighting. So then that's the reason I'm very optimistic about what's happening. there are days when I'm less optimistic than other days, but then I have to keep reminding myself that ideas do have consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. Good ideas will have good consequences. And if we care about it, we have to play our role in trying to spread this message. And when the days are sort of, you're low on a day and say, well, of course everything is perfect in Brazil, so you don't have to worry about what's going on in Brazil. But in the United States, we have problems. All of a sudden, we're the policemen of the world. They always want to send our kids and send our money, start another war, and print more money, and all these things. So it lends itself to days when you don't feel all that optimistic about what's happening. So even though we'll all be engaged, and I know every one of you are going to stay engaged, and you're going to be participating and finding something to do and helping people run for office, support other candidates, start a new group, write books, or whatever. But on the days that you don't feel so good, that it seems to be overwhelming, you have to look at life in a broader prospect. You have to say, how much control do I have over my life forever? Not too well. We don't know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day. So I think it's very important that you have fun doing it. And I hope, and I assume it seems to be a jolly crowd, that you meet people and you're like-minded, you get along together, you make friends. And I think that is so important. And for me, it was always much more delightful to come together when there was a basic understanding about the role of government and how the government is supposed to protect us. And that is the big issue. The big question should be that we all should ask, and we're currently asking that question once again. The founders of our country asked the question, what should the role of government be? And the role of government, according to them, was not to be a tyrannical king. We weren't to march into our houses and tax us and do all these kind of things of abuse. So they had a revolution and wrote a constitution, and the role of government was to be distinctly different. But today we have to ask that question. I know in the United States, I imagine throughout the world, it has to be asked, what should the role of government be? Well, some people say, just get rid of it. Just get rid of the government. We don't need government. But that's not going to go very far at the moment. So we have to decide what the government's role ought to be. Well, the government can't give us our liberty. Our liberty doesn't come from our government. But if we want to have a role for government, maybe what it should be is a very limited role to protect our liberties. Liberties don't come from our government. They either come to us in a natural way, as understood by some, or by a God-given right that we have a right to our lives, to our liberty, and we ought to have a right to the fruits of our labor. The things have been turned on its head, especially in the States. We have a Fourth Amendment that's supposed to be guarantee our privacy. And today, we have no privacy. We have something called NSA. It's hard to smile on all of you, for all we know. So we have a turned on its head. Our government doesn't protect our privacy. They destroy our privacy. We have no privacy. But they protect the secrecy of government. And we have a scandal going on in the States right now over the IRS. And the IRS, got out of hand. It was a political tool. It's been a political tool for a long time. That's the way governments operate. Punish the people who disagree with you by harassing them by the IRS. And that's been going on, but they got caught. And guess what? They can't find the email. It just disappeared. Can you imagine? I mean, you can't imagine. What if a corporation, which now are international corporations, in the United States, they enforce all laws, everybody's anytime they want. If the IRS, wants the information, the corporation looks like they're hiding it, then probably the government would bring that information up instantaneously and then probably arrest the guy the next day. But today, we can't find these records and we don't know what's going on. secrecy. That is our problem. There's too much secrecy in government, and we've lost our privacy. The government should, in a true republic, the government should be there to protect our privacy. Government should be there to protect our property too. You know, if you have property, you have a right to, engage in economic activity. It should be done in the open. Just not allowed to commit fraud. Oh, that's a strange idea. No fraud because the government's committing fraud all the time. I think the government creates theft. If the government can come, if you're not allowed to steal from your neighbor just because they have something, what right do we have to take a government agent and go and pass a law and go into somebody's house and take what they have because you think they have too much? Well, that's a violation of property rights. We need a strict interpretation of property rights. We need a strict interpretation of contract law, a way to enforce that. And a good place to start on contracts and honesty would be a law against counterfeiting, especially if it's the Federal Reserve system. Strongly about this because they've gone through inflation of the continental dollar, so they put into the Constitution not only gold and silver to be legal tender, but that restrains government. That means that was one of the ways to hold down the side of the government and keep them as their role of government be very limited. So only gold and silver was to be legal tender, and in 1792 they had a coin jack to design coins and how much gold and silver would be in each coin, and what the size would be. So when they did that, in the same clause, they talked about honest weights and measures, and they also talked about counterfeiting and how serious the crime would be if you counterfeited the currency. And they advised that they could get the death penalty for counterfeiting the money. Now, I've thought about that, but I've never made a very strong suggestion that we should reinstate that law and deal with the Federal Reserve in that manner. Obviously, the Federal Reserve, is a very, very powerful organization, and it has so much control over the economy and our lives. Control, and you've heard the lectures here on the business cycle. I mean, this is big stuff. And once again, the 20th century has proven them to be wrong. It's not a good system. It's falling apart. But nothing is going to happen if we don't present the case for freedom, for individual liberty, for sound money and property rights. If we aren't successful, groups like this, not only this group growing and having more influence, but many more groups growing, the replacement will be with more tyranny. There will be more tyrants who will come in because somebody will have to pick up the pieces. And but this is what makes it so wonderful, is there is this opportunity to present our case. Because the failure of the system, the ability to spread this message, and we have a better understanding now of what liberty is all about than ever before. I mean, even the founders had a good instinct about money. They knew that continental money wasn't very good. They knew gold and silver was good, but they didn't understand it. Even in the 19th century, where you consider we were on gold standard, it wasn't that great a gold standard. It was on again, off again. They had bimetallism. I think we're way ahead of that now. And in fact, it might not be a bad idea to let the marketplace and let people voluntarily decide what they want to use for exchanging. And I think that would be a great idea too. But over the years, I have continued to study the right of politics and try to spread these ideas. But I felt fortunate that through these many years that I got to meet many of the individuals that we still read about. There was one day in the early 1970s that I read a notice in our newspaper that day that Mises was coming to the University of Houston for a lecture, and there was only one other person in town then I might know who Mises was at that time. So another doctor said, oh, that's good. He said, let's go out with an hour strip away. So we both got some coverage and left our office for the afternoon and drove out. It must have been one of Mises' last lectures because he made his lecture tour and he was in his 90s and he lectured on socialism. So it was sort of neat to be able to not only read his books but actually see him and hear him lecture. They gave him, as usual, they didn't give him much of a room. They gave him a very, very little room. Maybe it was like a classroom. It probably was designed to hold maybe 75 people or so, but the place was jam-packed, all around and outside. And I stood by the door and outside. I wasn't there on time, but there was still a hunger and people growing to know him as well. Well, there was one time when Hayek was in Washington, D.C., he was there giving a lecture and visiting, and I got to meet him and went to dinner with him afterwards. And he impressed me as just such a dignified individual. Something that is sometimes rare in Washington. So that was interesting. But during the very first, I don't know if anybody would be familiar with the gold conferences when gold became legal back in the 1970s. That first conference, I was invited to Hans Sandler, who became close friends, and he would have me to Grove City College. Got to know him rather well. In fact, he became chairman. I was on that board for the economic education. He's influenced a lot of students over the years. But then the next individual I got to know even better than the rest was Murray Rothbard. How many here have heard of Murray Rothbard? And his hours were stay up late and sleep late. He'd stay up, especially with young people. He'd stay up and gab and talk to 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. So he was, of course, helpful in the Mises Institute in New Rockwell, closing it together. But let me just broaden the thought. I'm talking mostly about economics and this and Austrian economics and the mess that we're in. But I think we have to have a good understanding about why our message is so powerful and why it should be so popular and why it is when the people know about it. And I'm convinced that when one understands what liberty is all about, that it brings people together. And that's what I think is so neat. It shouldn't divide us. You shouldn't have liberals sitting over here and conservatives over here and people with different values. It shouldn't divide us on religion. It shouldn't divide us on anything else, because people, if they understand that liberty means that you get a chance to run your own life. And a libertarian is not judgmental. We don't tell people what they should do or don't do. We might have a preference, and we might not endorse what they do. And a lot of conservatives think, oh no, if I'm a libertarian, my goodness, somebody might smoke marijuana, and I don't like that. You don't have to smoke marijuana. And the commentator had to do this. He said, you libertarians, some of you will even want to legalize heroin. And of course, I didn't answer that question. I didn't deny it either. I said yes. I said, that is true. There are those of us that legalize it. And I said, but I'm going to ask you a question. So I asked the question to the audience. Now, if tomorrow the government legalizes heroin, raise your hand if you'd start using heroin tomorrow. Nobody did. You have to make your own decision about your lifestyle. Even the lifestyle that you might frown upon and criticize, you don't have a right. They're not hurting anybody else. If they're making their own lives vulnerable, that's their business. But That means conservatives have to be tolerant of other people if their lifestyles are different. But liberals need to be tolerant of those who make money and spend their money differently than they want, and they should be intolerant and say, well, we own the money and we will redistribute it. But I think so often it brings people together. If you talk about religion, our First Amendment in the States works pretty well in the sense that nobody's arguing for a national church. You know, you have all branches of churches and beliefs. You have people that are atheists, and that's what happens in a free society. Is you legalize things, but you're not the final arbiter of what people should do, except for the non-aggression. Don't initiate force, don't initiate violence. And I've been thinking, if people would ever understand that, even from the far left or wherever, if they know what non-aggression principle means, and it brings about peace and prosperity, how can anybody turn it down? You know, they have turned it down because those who have risen to the top, who can play on the envy and being abuse the government for so long, yes, they get away with it, but they're not going to get away with it so much longer. So we now have this opportunity because the problems are going to be there, and people are looking for something else. So the freedom movement is alive and well. It's growing by leaps and bounds, and young people are especially attracted to it. And it's just something that we ourselves, those of us who have worked on this for a long time, have to take some responsibility for it. Because if it's anywhere close to how wonderful I think it is, why haven't everybody joined this? Why hasn't everybody joined this? Because it seems so logical and good. Well, it's part of our selling that we haven't been able to sell it, and partially because government's been able to pass out a lot of benefits. Right now, welfareism is still pretty popular. You know, a lot of people think the government has to take care of them. We have a right to this, we have a right to medical care, a right to a house, right to everything else. But they don't realize that there's a limit to that. And I think that is what's happening right now. That these limitations are being met, and we are having this wonderful chance to present our case. Now, I have a personal reason why I think liberty is such a good issue, that we then have to assume responsibility for ourselves. You know, if nobody does, and everybody's still, you know, have aggressive principles, the whole thing falls apart, but having responsibility for oneself is important. And I think that the most important thing for me is in a free society where government's not telling me what to do and just trying to provide a peaceful environment, that we have a responsibility to work for our own excellence. And everybody's excellence is going to be different in different fields. Some are going to be much, in some ways, more successful than others. But working toward excellence gives personal satisfaction, and that is important. And also, to work on virtue. People should work on virtue, but you have to realize some people in society are really very virtuous, and doing that is so much better. Now, if we turn this responsibility over to government, which too often has, you know, it's the government's responsibility to make sure that we're taken care of and we get our education and all these things. What we do is we give up our liberty. How can government do it? Not only economic liberty, because they're redistributing wealth, but your liberty of choices. Yes, okay, if you want to ride your bicycle. I said, I don't wear a helmet. I should. But should the government tell me that I can't ride my bike, get to ride a helmet? You know, oh yes, you have to, because if you get hurt, you have to go to a government-run hospital, and you don't want that extra expensive. But one thing leads to another. You have to assume the responsibility for it, because the more responsibility you give to the government, the more liberty one loses, and the worse the situation gets, and we end up with this mess. And what happens when we do this internationally? We know about personal liberty, we know about economic liberty, but just think of the mess we've been pointing out with these many, many years. especially in the last much worse since 9/11. Constant wars, no end war. So we went to Korea. North Korea, I think, is still anti-American. We went to Vietnam. That didn't go well. 60,000 Americans died. And yet we lived there. We lost that completely. And now they're friendlier. Now they're friendlier than ever. We achieved more in peace in Vietnam than we did in a decade with the French and the Americans fighting in Vietnam. You can win more in peace than you can in war. There was a meeting in 1975 with the American Colonel Summers on Colonel 2, and it was a very remarkable short conversation, at least the part that I referred to, because they were talking about repatriation of prisoners and that sort of thing. But Summers, who was pretty hawkish and wanted to keep fighting and that sort of thing, had to get the last word in, so he tells two. He said, he says, you guys, you never beat us once in any military battle. And two very calmly said, you're absolutely right. It's also irrelevant. It was totally irrelevant. And how much irrelevancy is going on today? I mean, it looks like now, we're even losing some of the military battles, on what's going on. But, no, you cannot win the peace with just constant fighting. You cannot do that. And that is what we're doing. The American government, the American people should not continue to endorse, and this is one thing that I'm very, very adamant about. We should not be the policemen of the world. We should not be telling any country what they should do within their internal affairs. And we shouldn't be involved in any of the entangling alliances. And we shouldn't enforce U.S. federal law in other countries and telling other banks what they have to do. In other words, yes, I want to bring all our troops home, but I want to bring all our law enforcement agencies home as well and concentrate on building a system in the United States that would emphasize liberty, where people would say, that is a great country, why don't we try to emulate what the United States is doing? I'll tell you what, the United States cannot force even what they think is the good part on other countries by force. It doesn't work. And they tried that in the French Revolution. That was a total failure. And right now, it's failing for us. So I would say the initiation of force by us as individuals in our government against us, it should never be used. We should never initiate force against another. Can you think of a better world if everybody would endorse the principle, just that one principle, non-aggression, don't use force against anybody else? Problem solved. Well, I want to close by just saying congratulations once again for your organization and the growth and constant interest. And it is now more international than ever before. I mean, it is not going to be, something happening in the United States. We're in it together. The dollar brings us together. They will do it people. And we're all in it together. And I think this is, something that is going to be resolved one way or the other. So I am very enthusiastic about what is happening, and I'm going to believe that we will prevail. I really do. I think there's reason to believe that can happen. But it's going to take probably another generation. It's going to take a lot of the young people. This is why young people want to do this and realize, there's something wrong with the system. Our students are getting out of college, they owe $80,000, $90,000, they get a degree sometimes, and then they can't get a job, and they can't pay their bills, and it's a mess, and they know there has to be something else. And young people know that the war is on. These were so emphatic, these wars Some people argue, oh, we didn't get out of the world, we didn't get out of the Depression until we had World War II. That's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, building bombs and, blowing them up doesn't make anybody wealthy except a few profiteers. The other day, we agreed that Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, he said, well, I guess the pressure's too great. I got to go in there and help because ISIS, the band that's up there forming ISIS, they're dangerous. They're going to take over the world. So I guess I better help out. So we're going to send in the Air Force, and we're going to stop this ISIS group. Well, ISIS probably originated in Syria, and they've been trying to do what we've been trying to do, is get rid of Assad, and that hasn't gone well. So we sent some weapons up there. Guess what? ISIS ends up with the weapons, and then they form this group. They come into Syria, and they have some modest successes. So we decided we have to go in and stop them. And the number one job that our Air Force had was to go up there and destroy all the American weapons that they had. All that effort, all that spending to overthrow a guy that hates ISIS. He held them in check. What do we do with Saddam Hussein? He didn't like the Al-Qaeda. He didn't let them in their country. Same way with Iran. Iran wants to participate in this. Let them do it. So we don't need to do it. And if we'd be out there, it seems like we stir up so much trouble over there. And financially, it's going to end. It ended for the Soviets. It'll end us. The empire will end. Empires generally never end by common sense. Unfortunately, you can't. Don't expect there's going to be a transition in Congress. All of a sudden, get people in and vote correctly. It's not going to happen. It's good to get as many as we can to state principle. But this will end badly. It's going to end with a financial crisis, and the empire will end, and we'll come home. But then again, what are we going to build it with? And you're going to help, I hope, build this thing. It is building a free society based on the principle of individual liberty. Thank you very much for listening.
Muito bem, então vamos começar a sessão de perguntas. Eu queria pedir um favor, assim que nós terminássemos a sessão de perguntas com o povo, vocês não deixassem, não saíssem da sala. Eu tenho um aviso muito importante para dar, e tenho certeza que todos gostarão do aviso e não se arrependerão de ficar alguns minutos. É um aviso muito rápido, assim que o povo nos deixar o palco após responder as perguntas. Tá? E não esqueçam de entregar no final do evento, lá embaixo, no primeiro curso, a ficha de avaliação, por favor. Bom, foram muitas perguntas. O tempo que nós temos, infelizmente, será impossível formulá-las todas. Assim que estiver em inglês, eu vou passar para o assessor do João, para que ele eventualmente responda posteriormente. A primeira pergunta, então, é a seguinte: se me permite fazer a primeira pergunta? Sim, claro. Não botou. Exercendo a sua autoridade de presidente.
Well, it's a privilege to have you here with us in Brazil for the first time. I hope you can come many times. I have a question for you. I bet that some of the people here are thinking what to do, what to proceed, what their careers should be. Some of them might be thinking about the academia, other people to go into business, to make money, and really help Mrs. Brazil. And some other people might be thinking about eventually running for office and taking you as an example. And Brazilians are very cynical about office in general, being part of the government, as you can imagine. So what does it take to be successful as you are successful in our sense that to be true to your principles all over your career and be there and make a difference?
Yeah, I'm not, do I have to turn the switch on? You hear this?
Yes.
Okay, good. You know, I'm not even certain I get to ask that question a lot. I mentioned before what I thought everybody should do, find out what you want to do. But why did I say my set of principles? I don't have a precise answer. The only thing I can tell you is if somebody asked me to not do it, I'd have been a preacher. You know, if they say, well, on this page, I want you to do this. You know, in the first week I was there, they would ask me, and I said, well, no, I campaigned on this. I can't do that. Or I promised to obey the Constitution, so I can't do that. So I think it's just a matter of what your personal values are. I just thought that Calvin was so untrustworthy that what's the difference? In my mind, when I was thinking about going to Washington, I thought it was a truth. I was honest with my wife. I told her I'm not going because I'm not advocating, transferring wealth or whatever. So I really thought the best I can do is explain my position, because at that time I wanted to talk in the 70s about Bretton Woods and the monetary system. And that's where everybody was like, they didn't understand what the Fed was doing. So I thought, well, then when I won, I thought, well, that's interesting. So I wanted to see if I could vote that way and see what would happen, see if I would be reelected. It's sort of a test, because I just didn't have the burning desire to be there. I think people who want in politics, if that is your only desire, it's not a good one, because that's when you're going to flip-flop around and do it. It doesn't hurt to use it as a vehicle. For me, it was a vehicle to do it. But doing that was, pretty natural for me, to run. And then I thought if I left a record and to see if I could be reelected, that would be interesting. And then it went on for more years than I thought, because I had been in for 8 years, 4 terms, and then I didn't want the career, so I went back to medicine for 12 years, and I got reelected, and it was still relatively calm up until 2008, and that's when somebody got me talked into running for that race. So I thought the most I could probably do is try to set a standard, leave a voting record, which somebody someday, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years, when they're more open to these ideas, they would look back and say, oh, this is what he was doing. So I was pretty shocked that people gained attention, in 08 and forward. But I think it has a lot to do with the organizations that we're starting, the Mises Institute, and these ideas. I think a lot of people give me credit for spreading these ideas. I think it has to be mutual, because I was getting responses from the universities, early on, even before I had been campaigning myself. There was some movement on the campuses, anti-Fed movements and anti-war movements. They were going on before that, so it was there, and I think that it was just a matter of time. All I know for sure is I've been more miserable if I would have had to not vote the way I thought was right.
Bom, a próxima pergunta. O senhor disse em 2008 que em 2003 ninguém o escutava. Em 2008 já havia pessoas que o escutavam. Agora, em 2014, que o senhor é um superstar, qual é o impacto disso na atuação do senhor em defesa das ideias da liberdade e na política dos Estados Unidos?
So the question was, you told in 2008 that in 2003 nobody really knew you. Then in 2008 started getting traction, and in 2014 you're a pop star. So how does that impact you in your fight for liberty?
Well, in some ways we talked a little bit about that, but I think the big change was the crisis was hit. And once again, I think think they like to target and pinpoint exactly what's happening. We're an individual rather than just saying, well, the movement did this. But, you know, because I was on financial services and I was writing about, you know, the bubble, the excessive credit, and the forced loaning, you know, to people who don't qualify for loan. This is bad news. We're going to have a bubble first. And then it did. And that seemed to come together. And that was a big event, you know, the financial crisis of 08 and 09. So I think that helped propel the interest of, that there was more attention, especially because I just happened to be in the presidential race.
Próxima pergunta. O senhor algumas vezes falou em revolução libertária, que a revolução libertária estava a caminho, estava prestes a acontecer. Considerando que o governo sempre teve problema, sempre foi ineficiente, qual é a opinião do senhor a respeito dessa revolução libertária hoje?
So the question was that you sometimes have mentioned a libertarian revolution that was about to come. Considering that the government is enormously inefficient, how do you see that revolution going into the future?
Well, the revolution, the question of the libertarian revolution, it's ongoing. You know, recently there was some major articles in the New York Times about a libertarian moment. And my explanation was that it wasn't a precise moment, because I thought about the transition that I witnessed myself, you know, the past 34 years. So the transition is there, and there may be a moment of time sometime down the road where there will be more influence in Washington. But I think it's ongoing. I think it's building. It has its occasional setbacks. But something's happened these last couple of weeks that I think emphasizes the strength of the libertarian movement, because around the world, especially in our country, there's a lot of articles out to prove the libertarians are wrong. You know, libertarians are wrong. And that means they're on the defensive. And this has come up because we were gaining a whole lot on the anti-intervention, anti-war position. And we had won some votes up there. We put pressure on the president not to stop bombing Syria. But now with ISIS apparent, successes that they're having, a lot of our politicians now have backed off, you know, and they're afraid to say it. But no, I think it's ongoing, and I think that the big test will be the next financial crisis, which I think there will be one. Exactly how it's going to evolve, I don't think anybody knows, or exactly when it's going to come. But I think it's going to be bigger than the one we had in 08, 09. And then we better be on our toes to present our case.
Especialmente em países em desenvolvimento, países mais pobres, uma discussão dos próprios liberais e libertários, de que forma as ideias da liberdade podem ajudar efetivamente aquelas pessoas mais pobres, em condições mais desfavoráveis. Então, a pergunta é, de que forma essas ideias da liberdade podem efetivamente contribuir para que essas pessoas saiam dessa situação de pobreza ou eventualmente de miséria?
This is a question about the poor, especially in developing countries such as Brazil. How can the ideas of libertarian policies related to liberty effectively help these people out of their state?
There's always a spring. But the only way we can win this is to convince the people that there's been a lot of government, whether it's socialism or welfareism or communism or what else. They never solved the problem of the poor. You know, the freer the society, the more wealthy is the society. So, but they have to be convinced of this. And that's the tough job, because immediately, you know, if you wave a wand right now and say, okay, everybody's on their own, that's going to be tough. But I don't think that I would work on a system where you would do that. You know, I've often said that if I could cut $100 billion out of our militarism overseas, that I would spend half of it on tiding people over and taking care of the elderly that we thought would be so dependent. but I wouldn't want it to be a permanent thing. But I don't think that's going to be our choice. Our choice is going to be who's going to pick up the pieces. And that's why they have to be convinced that they're going to be better off. But it is a tough one because I don't believe freedom is why people are poor and not doing well. I think the countries that are really poverty don't have an understanding, and I mentioned the speeches, property rights, property ownership, contract rights, and sound money, and that's where prosperity comes from, and the assumption that you have responsibility for oneself, because people all of a sudden work harder if they have to do it. Well, I'll tell you what, United States got 92 million people now that are unemployed, you know, and there's still a lot of wealth in the states, but the numbers are not looking good. So it's back to the ideas. People have to be convinced that they will be better off, you know, in a free society. But there are some countries that never honored and respected private property. That's where it's really pretty tough. And all we can do is, if we can't go and see those governments and force them to be good people and obey all those rules, then the other option is for all of us who do have some say in the representative government that we do our best to set the standard. But unfortunately, we don't have many good standards. I guess in my lifetime, the best example of how well a free market did was the comparison between Hong Kong and communist China. I mean, you know, one of my daydreams would be, because we've had such a lousy policy with Cuba, you know, I happen to think that we should trade with Cuba, we should travel with Cuba, and we shouldn't have put sanctions on Cuba for all these years. So I think that my daydream would be that I could have one day to design what Cuba should be like. You know, write the rules on property and money and all that. Turn Cuba into Hong Kong. But then why don't we turn Brazil and put giant Hong Kong and set the standard for the
world. O senhor, durante décadas, foi um grande defensor da liberdade, pensamento austríaco na política formal dos americanos. E qual é a dimensão da influência do pensamento austríaco e americano dentro do Partido Republicano hoje? Sabemos que seu filho atua na política formal. Qual é a dimensão dessa influência hoje dentro do Partido Republicano?
The question is about how much influence does free market ideas and Austrian economics and libertarianism have in the Republican Party itself. And he mentioned also your son. Right there.
Unfortunately, not a whole lot. And no, there's not a whole lot of influence. Rand understands Austrian economics and a few others in the House, but I would say it's a small number. But I'm also convinced that converting the Republican Party to Austrian economics is too narrow of a goal. You think Keynesianism was a democratic position? Nixon told us we're all Keynesians now. We all believe in welfareism and fiat money. So if we're going to win, we're going to have to influence, all the parties and all the people, which means that plenty in here that are thinking about are our teachers. I mean, this is what Monsanto was doing. He got his PhD on nieces. I guess he taught thousands of students, you know, and has a lasting influence. So that's the only thing that we can do is continue to change people's minds. It's not political. Politics is a result. The 80% counts, and 51% will be reflected in the Congress. But unfortunately, I can't say, you know, I tried my best. I had a Liberty Caucus luncheon I had once a week. The Libertarians come in, and still, some who came every week still didn't quite get it. But they've been so locked in to what they're taught in college. So professors, what they teach is remembered for a long, long time. And unfortunately, we've exposed Paul Samuelson and Paul Krugman for too long. Get Roy Rothbard and Mises into the university.
O senhor sempre foi um grande crítico das intervenções militares dos Estados Unidos em outros países e sempre defendeu também a redução de gastos do governo americano na defesa. Considerando atualmente os conflitos internacionais, especialmente esse que o senhor mesmo mencionou, esse grupo terrorista ISIS, como é que os Estados Unidos conseguiriam se proteger dessas ameaças atuais se esse programa de redução de gastos na área militar tivesse sido adotado pelos governos passados?
One, of course, the question is about foreign intervention and militarism, and you advocated always for reduction in military expenditures. So how can U.S. citizens protect themselves in case the military expenditures are reduced?
Well, I'll tell you what, we have a lot to worry about in the United States, and we are endangered. But the greatest danger comes from NSA, and the FBI, the CIA, starting wars, overthrowing governments, and financing the unbelievable profits to the military-industrial complex. So those are the danger. Who's going to invade us? I don't think it's going to come from here. I don't think it's going to, the Russians aren't going to invade us. I don't even think they're going to. I don't think they really have invaded Ukraine. And that mess is all stirred up by some of our crazy policies. Nobody's going to invade the United States. And you say, yeah, but we have this obligation, this moral obligation. Well, if you think so, then you have a right to go. We shouldn't have any laws against you going over there and driving trucks through Afghanistan. Nobody's going to do that. But we don't gain anything. Just think of the mess that we have. I mentioned before, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya we're suffering from, Syria we're suffering from. And now they're looking to go into Ukraine, stir up trouble there. So very much, let's say, this is all an attack on American security by creating more enemies. And most people know I'm a strong believer that there is a phenomenon called blowback. And it's been, as a matter of fact, the term was coined by the CIA, that if we do too much overseas and kill people, that there's going to be a lot of resentment. And unfortunately, this is so tragic, and it just tears me out, that we probably, since we've been involved in Iraq, we probably have killed 1 million Iraqis. That just exposes us to just horrendous hatred, and it will not be solved, by just going over and killing more. Yeah, but ISIS is coming. Well, I happen to think ISIS is a consequence. That doesn't mean that there won't always be radicals. There's always going to be some radicals. But believe me, an imperfect world, we have Saddam Hussein and Assad and a few others, they held that in check. I think we were clean out of there. Those countries that have the greatest concern would come together and decide what they're going to do with ISIS. I don't think ISIS is a sign that they are so powerful, is that our policies have been such a failure. Just think, we started in 1990 against Iraq. And Madeleine Albright admitted that it was probably true that 500,000 children died because of our bombing and our sanctions against Iraq. So, and then we get over there and spend another $1 trillion, and 1,000 Americans have died, and we're still doing that in this total chaos. It's worse. So I think we're poor. Bin Laden had 3 goals. He wanted to he wanted us to drag us into a land war over there. Where are we right now? He wanted to bankrupt our country And believe me, our finances aren't all that hot up there. I mean, maybe it won't be too long, we'll be called the third world country. And then the other thing he wanted to do was cause dissension among the American people over this. And I don't want to think that a debate is dissension. And I think he might have been thinking at that time, the dissension that occurred in our 1960s, when the American people got sick and tired of Vietnam. But the bankruptcy and dragging us over to that war, I think is, exactly they're winning and we're suffering because we're less secure.
Bom, eu queria agradecer então ao João Paulo pela inspiradora e excelente palestra. Em nome de todos aqui, gostaríamos de agradecer a sua presença, a sua gentileza e a sua luta de décadas pela liberdade que influenciou muitos de nós e influencia a questão do Brasil. Muito obrigado. Duas palavras rápidas, uma delas um recado que eu acho que vocês vão apreciar. A primeira é, em nome do Instituto Brasil, eu gostaria de agradecer a cada um de vocês por ter dedicado tempo, dinheiro, lazer, para passar esse fim de semana com a gente, para poder aprender um pouco mais com as palestras sobre as ideias da Escola Austríaca. E foi um grande privilégio estar aqui para apresentar esse evento, para dividir essa divisão de conhecimento com vocês, esse compartilhamento de conhecimento com vocês. Então, em nome do Instituto Brasil, eu gostaria de agradecer a cada um de vocês por terem permanecido, por terem feito perguntas, e peço desculpas se nem todas as perguntas puderam ser respondidas. Relembrando, pedindo que vocês entreguem a ficha de avaliação lá no primeiro andar. E o recado que eu acho que vocês vão gostar um pouco, talvez não, é que o João estará, a partir de alguns minutos, no primeiro andar, para atender a cada um de vocês, se quiser um autógrafo, se quiser chegar uma foto. Então, podem ir com calma, o livro estará sendo vendido embaixo. Façam o livro com calma.
Depois, quando a festa vai fazer a